I'll never forget the story of Brian, my coworker when I was 17. He was in his mid-20s, a bit chubby, and honestly seemed like an ordinary laid-back guy. One day, he casually mentioned his crazy neighbors who would scream and bang on the walls over nothing, sometimes even when he sneezed. I didn't think much of it at the time. It just sounded like weird neighbors being, well, weird. Then Brian stopped showing up to work. A couple of months later, he was back. I asked where he'd been, and he said he was fired because he'd been in the hospital. That didn't sit right with me, getting fired for being hospitalized. But Brian waved it off, calling it personal reasons. I said it was good to have him back and didn't push further. A few days later, I was talking to a coworker who was close friends with Brian. He leaned in and asked, "Did Brian ever tell you what happened to him?" I admitted I had no clue. That's when he told me. Apparently, before Brian disappeared, his crazy neighbors had reached their limit, shouting at him through the walls for being too loud. Finally fed up, Brian called the cops. The police arrived and spent hours talking to his neighbors, or so he thought. When Brian called back later to ask why it was taking so long, the officer said, "We left over an hour ago. There was no one there." Turns out the neighbors weren't yelling at Brian. They didn't even exist. Brian had been hearing voices in his head. Shortly after, he was admitted to a mental hospital for treatment. To this day, I think about him and that moment when reality turned out to be something entirely different.